The Heavenly Hedgehogs, Standing in the Gap by Cynthia Whited and Tonya Rogers. Sparkling rays from the warm early morning sun bounced off the dew-covered grass in the meadow as Heath and Heather Hedgehog frolicked up and down a thin winding trail. They pranced back and forth, kicking up tiny drops of water to form a mist in the clear shiny air. The trail was barely visible to the other creatures that lived in the area, but Heath and Heather knew it well. They followed it over the soft slope of the meadow, through the tree line and down to the brook. This was their favourite place to play. It was quiet and peaceful there as the babbling water hummed a soothing song. Besides, most of their friends could be found there at one time of the day or another. One such friend was Mrs. Hedgebarrow, who lived in the row of hedges. Mrs. Hedgebarrow would chirp a good morning greeting to Heath and Heather and sing sweet melodies to them while they playfully scampered from one side of the hedge to the other. But on this morning, something was very different. Instead of her usual cheerful greeting, Mrs. Hedgebarrow was in a frantic state. She was flying back and forth over her nest in the hedge and squawking loudly. "Oh no! Oh no! This is terrible!" she screeched. "What can I do? What can I do?" Heath and Heather stopped in their tracks behind a nearby tree. Jerking their heads in confusion, they looked towards the hedge and then back at one another. "What's the matter with Mrs. Hedgebarrow?" Heath whispered to his little sister. "Achoo!" Heather gasped. "It sounds like she's in trouble." "Let's go find out," they shouted. "What's the matter, Mrs. Hedgebarrow?" "My eggs!" she squawked. "My eggs! He took one of my eggs!" Still circling above her nest and rambling, she cried, "I tried to hide them! I tried to protect them! What am I to do? What am I to do?" "Oh there, Mrs. Hedgebarrow," Heath said. "Please try to calm down." Heather balanced her teetering body on her hind legs and stretched to her full height. Then, straining her neck, with her eyes wide open, she looked all around, searching for clues to tell them who would do such an awful thing. The meadow seemed as peaceful and as calm as always to Heather, and she hadn't noticed anything different. "Do you know who the thief was?" she softly asked. "Did you see who took one of your eggs?" Beating her wings rapidly in the air, Mrs. Hedgebarrow cried out, "Willard! Willard the Weasel, that's who!" She let out a deep cry, and large tears spilled from her sad eyes, soaking her soft feathery cheeks. "I'm so upset! That bad Willard the Weasel took one of my eggs for his breakfast." Heath murmured under his breath, as his eyes jetted around the hedge, looking for tracks Willard might have left on the ground. "How did he get up to your nest?" he asked. "It's all my fault! It's all my fault!" the quivering sparrow answered between sobs. "Willard snuck through the little gap down there at the bottom of the hedge." She pointed to a small opening in the hedge, with her ruffled wing and whined. "I tried to fill it with as many twigs as I could, but it didn't work. Oh, this is all my fault." No, it's not your fault," soothed Heather. "You did the best you could. Why, how could you know that Willard would come stomping down those twigs and climb up the branches?" "Heather's right," Heath comforted. "No need for you to feel guilty." A deep wrinkle set across his forehead, and for several seconds it seemed the whole meadow took a deep breath. "The way I see it," Heath said, while waddling from the far side of the hedge where he had been conducting his investigation, "is that we need a plan." "A plan?" Heather and Mrs. Hedgebarrow asked. "Yeah," Heath turned to them and explained. "Think about it. Willard is bound to return, and we need to be ready when he does. Mrs. Hedgebarrow began to flap her wings frantically again and squawked, "Oh no, my eggs! He will probably come back for lunch. Soon, all my eggs will be gone. They will all be gone." "Please, Mrs. Hedgebarrow, please stop," Heather pleaded. "It doesn't help to get so upset. We have to figure out how to keep Willard away." She reeled around and rolled her eyes towards her brother. "We better think of something quick," she whispered. Oh yeah, quick," Heath muttered. A plan. We need a plan." He thought about the gap in the hedge, about the twigs not working, and he thought about Willard. "That's it!" Heath shouted. "All we have to do is keep Willard from getting into the gap." His eyes widened with relief, and he turned to stare at his sister. "And Heather, we are the perfect gap filler." "What are you talking about, Heath?" She studied his face for an answer. "What do you mean, we are?" "Come on, Heather," he said, puffing out his chest and strutting round the hedge in circles. "We'd make the perfect gap filler." "Huh." Heather was puzzled. Then suddenly she understood what he meant, and she squealed, "I get it!" She was excited at the thought of being able to help Mrs. Hedgebarrow, and clapped her front paws as she twirled around and around. "Our prickly spines do look a lot like a pile of twigs, don't they, Heath?" she chuckled. Heath beamed with pride at his clever plan, and a twinkle came to his eyes. If Willard tries to get in the gap, as I think he will, he'll be in for a big surprise. Mrs. Hedgebarrow tilted her head down towards the chattering hedgehogs. She was completely bewildered. "How will this save my eggs from Willard's next meal?" Heather giggled. "Listen, Mrs. Hedgebarrow, we hedgehogs have a built-in defence against our enemies. When someone tries to hurt us, we roll up into a ball, and our prickly spines stand up on their ends all over our backs." "Yeah," Heath grunted. "And when our enemy comes close enough, we just buck and throw ourselves forward." "What happens then?" Mrs. Heathbarrow asked. "Well," Heather stared deep into her brother's eyes and said firmly, "when we do this, our prickly spines scare away our attacker. We don't like to use our spines like that, but it works." "That's right," Heath snorted. "We don't want to hurt anyone, but Willard the Weasel, he took something that wasn't his. We've got to stop him stealing any more of your eggs." Heather calmly told the quivering friend, "Now you need to stay out of sight and try to be very quiet. Don't move a feather." Mrs. Hedgebarrow nodded her head. In her softest chirp she whispered, "Not a feather, not a feather." She flew to a nearby apple tree and found cover in its branches, making sure she had room to peek out and watch for Willard's return. Together, the prickly little hedgehogs waddled bravely toward the opening in the hedge. Climbing inside, they rolled into their combat forms. Heath snuffled nervously and whispered to his sister, "Boy, have we got a surprise for Willard?" In the meantime, just on the other side of the brook, Willard the Weasel was lazily sprawled on the grass, still pleased with himself about his morning victory. He was thinking about that delicious egg he'd stolen for breakfast. It wasn't long before the early morning sun had worked its way high into the midday sky, and the shortening shadows and swarming gnats signalled Willard that it was lunchtime. And lunch would be Hedgebarrow eggs. Willard slunk along the bank of the brook. The song-like babbling of the water muffled his approach. He didn't see anyone around and thought to himself, "How easy this is." The breeze wafted over the meadow and bent the grass first one way and then the next, hiding him as he crossed over to the hedge. With narrowing eyes, he peered confidently around the edge of the hedge toward the nest and thought, "Silly bird, she thinks she's fooling me with that pile of twigs in the gap of that hedge. How easy this will be. I will stand on the twigs and break them down. Then I will climb on the branches just like I did this morning. And when I am close to the nest, when I can reach the eggs, then I'll take one." His lips smacked with anticipation of how good the egg will taste. With the slyest of grins, he snarled, "Maybe I'll take all that silly sparrow's eggs this time. Yes, all the eggs." By the time he reached the gap, he was almost running. How easy! All the eggs! He leaped up in the air, coming down on the twigs with all his weight, so that he could spring up to the high branches of the hedge, when suddenly... "Ouch! Ouch!" Willard yelped. "What? Oh, ouch!" Under the pile of twigs, Heath and Heather pushed with all their might, bucking against the moving weight on their backs. Their prickly spines, which stuck out from their bodies, jabbed the soft soles of all four of Willard the Weasel's feet. He yelped and squealed as he ran for the refreshing cold water of the brook, where he could relieve the throbbing pain in his feet, caused by those very odd twigs. "I think we've seen the last of old Willard the Weasel," Heath laughed. "He won't be back," Heather shouted joyfully. "You can come down now, Mrs. Hedgebarrow. The coast is clear and your eggs are safe." Mrs. Hedgebarrow cried, "My eggs are safe! They're safe because you stood in the gap for me. Oh, thank you. Thank you for being such heavenly hedgehogs." This time Mrs. Hedgebarrow's tears were the cheerful kind. In the past, Mrs. Hedgebarrow had made Heath and Heather Hedgehog so very happy with her sweet morning songs. Now they returned her friendship by singing their very own song just for her. They sang and danced until the billowy white clouds that lined the horizon became a soft pink, and the water on the brook turned golden. And once again, everything was as it should be, down at the hedgerow in the meadow. The end. We hope that you loved Heavenly Hedgehog Standing in the Gap by Cynthia Whited and Tonya Rogers. Buy the book and read along. Watch again and sing along.
I'm standing in the gap, standing in the gap. I'm standing in the gap for you, gap for you. I'm praying night and day to keep the enemy away. I'm standing in the gap for you, in the gap for you. With the word of God, my planted feet are shod. I'm standing in the gap for you, for you. And when the enemy comes around, my prayers will loudly sound. I'm standing in the gap for you, in the gap for you. I'm standing in the gap, standing in the gap. I'm standing in the gap for you, the gap for you. I'm praying night and day to keep the enemy away. I'm standing in the gap for you, the gap for you. Now Jesus is there too. He's praying for me and you. I'm standing in the gap. It's true, it's true. His stronghold hedges me. His stronghold hedges you. And the enemy cannot come through, cannot come through. Oh, he's standing in the gap, standing in the gap. He's standing in the gap for you, the gap for you. He's praying night and day to keep the enemy away. He's standing in the gap with me. God was looking for a man to make up your hedge and stand. So here I am, I got your back, so step on through, my friend. We're standing in the gap, standing in the gap. We're standing in the gap for you, the gap for you. Well, we're praying night and day to resist the enemy, and he will have to flee away from you, away from me. Well, Jesus is that too. He's in the gap with me for you. I said we're standing in the gap for you, in the gap for you.